Good evening, everyone. I am Giancarlo Guerrero, and welcome to our first installment of exploring the nine symphonies of Ludwig van Beethoven on this very important year, 2020, which celebrates the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. A mass of images and remembrances and ideals comes instantly to mind when we hear the word symphony. For many of us, the idea of the symphony has been shaped overwhelmingly by the nine symphonies that Beethoven composed across a quarter of a century, 8 of them in 13 years. Beethoven's grandfather and his father were musicians at the electoral court in Bonn. Like many a musical child of his generation, young Ludwig suffered because Mozart, his senior by 15 years, had set impossible standards for child prodigies. Beethoven was not that kind of a child. He lacked the quickness and the seductive charm. Nonetheless, he composed, made impressive progress at the piano, and even became a competent string player. At age 16, he visited Vienna and played for Mozart, who said, "Keep an eye on him. He will make a big noise in the future and in the world someday." 5 years later, Beethoven had an opportunity to show some of his music to Haydn, who had stopped at Bonn on his way to London. Haydn was very impressed and suggested to the elector himself to send the young musician to Vienna to study with him. Beethoven set out in early November of 1792. He never saw his birthplace again. Beethoven learned much from Haydn's scores and would continue to do so all of his life, but the actual lessons with the master, then entering his 60s, were not quite a success. Haydn was very put off by Beethoven's relaxed religion views, his left-wing politics, and his rough manners. When he came to formal education, he did better with Johann Schenk, who was an experienced theater composer, and with the famous Antonio Salieri, made famous as Mozart's rival in the movie Amadeus. Beethoven was well aware of the high compositional standards set by Mozart and Haydn, especially in this particular art form. Haydn had composed 104 symphonies and Mozart 41. Even though Beethoven had amassed an impressive catalog that included 10 piano sonatas, 2 sonatas for cello and 3 for violin, 6 string trios, 6 string quartets, Beethoven waited until 1800, when he was 29 years old, to unveil his first symphony. He conducted the premiere on April 2nd of that year at the Hofburg Theater in Vienna. In a gesture of very savvy public relationships, he included a symphony by Mozart and 2 movements of Haydn's oratorio, The Creation. The symphony is in C major, and it is scored for the standard orchestra of the time: 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, 2 trumpets, timpani, and strings. The first movement opens with the standard slow introduction that usually opened most symphonies of the time: woodwinds and horns accented by plucked strings, slowly playing a question and answer pair of dissonant chords, in the wrong key, by the way. This is a formula that ought to end a piece, and using it to begin one is a good Haydn joke. Beethoven gives us 3 such cadences at different pitches that when the strings finally play non-pizzicato for the first time, we arrive at the key of G major. The pleasantly mysterious introduction keeps the music exploring and moving forward with great skill until we reach the quick tempo, also referred to as the exposition. It is quite the opening. I can promise you that the audience at that first performance must have been really shocked to hear a dissonant chord to begin a new work. But then again, this is Beethoven, the revolutionary. The exposition usually has two main themes. Here, the first theme is introduced by the strings alone. It is a perky melody, and when the winds enter, it is with the same cadences that we heard in the opening, but at this time, the tempo indication is marked allegro con brio, which means with spirit. The second theme is beautifully scored for solo woodwinds, with the accompaniment being derived from the strings. The entire movement sparkles with genuine energy, and it is particularly colored by the brilliant and inventive writing for the winds. Actually, one critic complained that it sounded more like a wind band than an orchestra. After the exposition, we move to the development section of the movement. Here, the composer is supposed to develop the material from the exposition in different creative ways. In the case of Beethoven's First Symphony, the development section is quite adventurous. Beethoven truly pushes the main themes in the exposition through many different interesting transformations. I have to be honest with you, every time I hear that development section, I always get goosebumps. The way that Beethoven treats all of the main melodies that we heard in the exposition and just literally sprinkles them one on top of each other is absolutely genius. The next section is called the recapitulation, where the composer is expected to bring back the exposition. Most composers would just repeat both main themes undisturbed. But for a genius like Beethoven, this is another opportunity to continue giving us wonderful surprises. Remember those dissonant opening woodwind cadences from the beginning? Here, Beethoven expanded even further, giving them an exalted presence. After the recapitulation, we reach the coda, which in Italian actually means tail, which wraps up the movement with trumpet and timpani fanfares that bring glowing brightness and heroism to the music. It's so exciting. Symphonies usually follow the fast, slow, minuetto, fast movement structure. Beethoven's first symphony really doesn't have a slow movement. The second movement is marked andante cantabile con moto, which means flowing and song-like, but with forward motion. The fact that this movement is in 3/8 rhythmic meter makes me wonder if Beethoven is trying to pull a fast one by placing this subliminal minuetto in the second movement. Notice that it begins with a simple fugue started by the second violins, followed by the violas and the cellos, then the basses, and then the bassoons, and then finally the first violins and the winds. Beethoven clearly enjoys that, unlike a string quartet, an orchestra provides drums. Here, the timpani accompany the 3/8 tune for flute and violins with chords that are actually playing in 2/8. So you hear a constant chaos in the rhythm because basically you have 2 and 3 going at the same time. This is very advanced rhythmic writing for the 1800s. Beethoven calls his next movement a minuetto, but apart from being a third movement of a symphony and in 3/4, connection with the old French court dance is nil. Here, he's clearly following the example of 1790s quartets, but not the symphonies of Haydn, who also kept calling such movements minuets. Beethoven is writing a really fast 1-to-a-bar scherzo. Your tongue would cramp and your arm would fall off if you try to count or beat 1, 2, 3 in each measure. Beethoven surprises and amuses us by setting a slow introduction at the beginning of the finale. In the first movement, he had used a scale to make his way from the adagio to the allegro. Here, he does the same thing, except that now he makes a joke out of it. It is so simple that it is absolutely brilliant. He starts with the whole orchestra playing the note G in unison. Then you hear the main motif of the last movement being born right in front of you, starting with 3 notes, then 4, then 5, then 6, up to 7, before giving you the full ascending scale. Beethoven definitely had lots of fun with scales in this movement. The cosmic beginning nicely sets the mood for the very high-spirited conclusion. I can definitely imagine the ending of this symphony when it was first premiered in 1800, receiving that same level of appreciation audience. It is always remarkable to me to listen to the first symphony of Beethoven and compare it to other great first symphonies in history, whether it's Brahms or Mahler or Bruckner or Stravinsky, and how much of a pressure it must have been for these composers to put out that first symphony, because they knew that whatever they wrote was going to be compared to all before them. And in the case of Beethoven, this must have been even more difficult because of the fact that he had to live up to the standard set by Haydn, who was still very much alive, and Mozart. Something that is quite remarkable, that is probably one of the most difficult things for composers to achieve, language. Composers can spend a lifetime trying to come up with a language that is particularly theirs. But in the case of Beethoven, we hear very clearly, even in this first symphony, that he clearly, as a musician, as a human being, and as a composer, and in this first presentation, we still hear that very clear Beethoven language. He's still paying homage to the tradition set by Mozart and Haydn, and at the same time, pushing the traditions in a way that composers will never look back. And by the end of all the 9 symphonies that he wrote, he made it impossible for the generation that came after, because in many ways, after he was done and when he died, composers were not willing to write symphonies because now they had to live up to the standard set by Beethoven. But this first symphony to me is one of the great genius works that really told us what was to come. Next week, we're going to explore the second symphony, where Beethoven still is paying homage to the traditions of Haydn and Mozart, but like the first symphony, is pushing things further and surprising and shocking his audience as he went along. By the time we get to the eroica, the third symphony, Beethoven basically told tradition to forget it because he's going to go his own way. But we will get to that in due time. I hope that every one of you is staying healthy and safe at home, and we are thankful for you joining us in exploring this wonderful first symphony, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we will discuss Beethoven's majestic second symphony. Good night.